10 things you didn't know Islam invented. Number 10. University. If you asked the question, what was the first university in the world, you'd probably get a lot of people giving the most famous historical examples, like Oxford, Cambridge, and maybe even the University of Bologna. But those people would be about 2 centuries off. The world's first recognisable university was actually the University of Al-Qurawin in Fez, Morocco. It was founded in the year 859 by Fatima al-Fihri. That's not to say there weren't other similar learning institutions before that, some even dating back to 3500 BC. But Al-Qurawin is unique since it's the first ever to have granted degrees, and what's more, it's still operating to this day. The institution is home to some of the oldest Islamic texts in the world, including a 9th century Quran written on deerskin. It even counted Pope Sylvester II in its alumni, who is said to have introduced Arabic numerals to Europe after studying there. All that said, it was still quite different from modern establishments. Much like Oxford, Bologna, and even Harvard in the 1600s, Al-Qurawin began as a centre of religious studies before becoming a university in the more modern sense. Number 9. Natural selection theory. Chances are you probably associate the concept of evolution with Charles Darwin, celebrated biologist, author of On the Origin of Species, and a man whose beard-growing capability makes my scriptwriter incredibly jealous. But what if I told you that there was another man who had a claim to the idea long before Darwin? A man who went by the name Al-Jahiz. Al-Jahiz was a 9th century philosopher and theologian who's now most famous for his work, The Book of Animals. It covers a lot of ground, but it includes this passage. Environmental factors influence organisms to develop new characteristics to ensure survival, thus transforming them into new species. Animals that survive to breed can pass on their successful characteristics to their offspring. That sounds a lot like evolution to me. Now I should say that Al-Jahiz made the argument in favour of God's design, so he didn't exactly lay out a concept of pure evolutionary science here. But as far as theories go, this guy was clearly ahead of his time. Number 8. Alcoholic spirits. Distillation has existed for millennia in some form, but while crude methods date back to the Greeks, the science didn't really develop until the Islamic Golden Age. Known as the father of chemistry, Jabir ibn Hayyan was instrumental in the development of processes like crystallization, research into acids and alkalis, and most notably, designing the alembic still. Now, Jabir initially used the apparatus to distill wine into a flammable spirit, which he said was of little use, but of great importance to science. While we don't know who was responsible, it wasn't long before it was used to make alcohol that Arab poet Abu Nuwas described as the colour of rainwater and hot inside the ribs as a burning firebrand. Sounds familiar to me. So, even if unintentional, you have Jabir to thank for shot, everybody. Oh, and fun story here, when his works were translated into Latin, Jabir became Geber. The alchemical code that he used to write the book was so incomprehensible to European scholars that they called it Geberish. Or gibberish, I guess. So that's where the word comes from. Neat extra fact for you there. Number 7. Do, re, mi. Fans of the sound of music will undoubtedly be familiar with do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Now, music theory buffs know that as solfege, where pupils are taught to associate a note of the musical staff with a specific sound. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. The system is normally credited to an Italian monk named Guido d'Arezzo, who was said to have based the syllables on a Latin hymn. But there's actually a strong case that it was in fact taken from the Arab world. Musicologist Michael Vincent makes the argument that his field is often preoccupied with Western Europe and ignores the rest of the world, pointing back to an 18th century compendium of musical theory written by Jean-Benjamin de Laborde. Laborde noted the extreme similarities between the Italian and Arabic syllables, the latter being dal, ra, mi, fa, sad, la, sin. Musicologist Henry George Farmer even went as far as saying the monk's hymn was based on the syllables, not the other way around, because it doesn't make sense on its own. All of that, plus cultural exchange between Italy, France and Islamic Spain, makes it very possible that d'Arezzo was actually just the first European to write down the system. Number 6. Automatic music. You probably know of the player piano, the iconic automatic musical instrument from the 1900s. But more than 1,000 years before people were feeding spoons of sheet music into fancy sets of wood and ivory, the Islamic world was sitting back and relaxing to organ tunes. All the way back in 850, a group of scholars called the Banu Musa brothers of Baghdad published a book of ingenious devices. Great name. The work included instructions on how to make a bunch of mechanisms like valves, cranks, and even automatic water fountains. But possibly the most notable innovation of the lot was their hydraulic organ, which used programmable air and water pressure mechanics to operate a flute. According to music writer Charles B. Fowler, that system remained the basic device to produce and reproduce music mechanically until the second half of the 19th century. Luckily, while a lot of the brothers' works are now lost due to Mongol pillaging, there are plenty of recreations of the hydraulic organ in music museums around the world. It could even be considered one of the first examples of robotics. Number 5. Flying machines. For the majority of human history, man has been trapped on the ground like some kind of flightless bird moron. But who do we thank for saving us from the surly bonds of gravity? Is it the Wright brothers? Is it Leonardo da Vinci? Perhaps, but first, spare a thought for Abbas ibn Firnas. Long before the concept for flying machines that we're familiar with, this Spanish polymath of North African Berber descent undertook an audacious attempt at flight. In the year 875, he launched from a tower using a cloak designed to mimic birds' wings. The machine was made from a wooden, likely bamboo frame lined with silk and decorated with bird feathers, because who says science can't have a sense of style too? The flight, by the way, was actually largely successful, but Furness didn't account for reaching the floor again, so neglected to make a landing mechanism. As a result, he ended up breaking his back upon landing. But luckily he survived the fall, and his works went on to set the stage for aviators the world over. Number 4. Modern soap. Substances resembling soap stretch all the way back through history, from ancient Babylon through to the Roman Empire and early China. But the problem with those is that while they could be used for cleaning, they were pretty gross, as untreated animal fat tends to be. Ugh. It wasn't until the 9th century Islamic Middle East that soap we would recognise came into being. And it's all thanks to a guy called Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi. Al-Razi, along with other alchemists over the centuries, developed hard, pleasant-smelling toilet soap using mixtures of fats, oils, alkalis, and occasionally lime for that citrusy freshness. In fact, by the 1200s, the Islamic world had turned the production of soap into a full-scale industry, with exports across the Middle East and through to Europe coming out of bases like Nablus, Fez, Damascus, and Aleppo. While it's not really provable, it's generally believed that the innovation in soap came from the Islamic faith's emphasis on hygiene, especially when it comes to religious activities like prayer. This is a doctrine that also informed Islam's early adoption of toothbrushes called miswaks. Number 3. Coffee. I don't need to tell you that coffee's a big deal. It fuels the working world, it provides livelihoods for millions of farmers, and it's the reason I'm so chirpy on camera. But what are the drink's origins? Was it Italy, the most celebrated purveyor of espresso? Perhaps Brazil? Well, no and no. The first credible evidence of drinking coffee comes from Sufi monasteries of Yemen in the 15th century, where it was used as a way for religious scholars to work deep into the night. But before that, there are quite a few claims based on folk history. For example, a Yemeni mystic supposedly saw birds overhead acting very excited, so he ate some of their beans and felt the buzz himself. The oldest account goes back to 9th century Ethiopia, where a farmer took some beans to a local monk. He denounced them and threw them into the fire, but noticing the trademark smell made the roasted grounds into a beverage. But given the complete lack of substantiation there, Yemen's our best bet. Number 2. The scientific method. Nowadays, anyone even remotely well-versed in science knows that hypotheses are proved by constant iteration and scrutiny by others. In other words, it's not deemed true until a lot of people try to disprove it and fail. That's what we call the scientific method, something many would accredit to English medieval friar Roger Bacon. In fact, though, the true origin came more than 200 years before, at the turn of the 11th century. Ibn al-Haytham was an Arab scientist who completed his most important work in Cairo. Most notably, he took the ancient conceptions of optics by Euclid and Plato and proved them false, showing that our eyes don't emit light to see, but they in fact take it in. He also proved that light travels in straight lines, explained the science of mirrors, and showed how light bends through different surfaces. But perhaps most importantly, his work, the Book of Optics, gave exact instructions on how to replicate his findings. Al-Haytham made all those advances while telling people to scrutinize him and encouraging them to scrutinize themselves. And that, my friends, is good science. Number 1. Hospitals. Treatment centres for the sick are nothing new. From the temples for Greek healer gods right through to medieval Europe and beyond, they always existed in some capacity. But the medieval Islamic world gave us what we might recognise now as a hospital. Known as Bimaristans, a mix between Bimar, meaning sick, and Stan, meaning place, Islamic hospitals were the first establishments that openly catered to the health problems of the general public. This is whether they were lepers, the mentally ill, or retirement homes for people without families. In part societies, it was normally for a very specific and normally very religious purpose. For example, some Christian monasteries had healing centres, and ancient Rome had a recovery site for gladiators. Unlike them, Bimaristans were obligated to serve everyone, no matter their faith or where they came from. Also, they were funded by waqfs. These are obligatory donations from the wealthy under Islamic law, and so treatment was free. So take note, America, if medieval Cairo managed single-payer healthcare more than 1,000 years ago, What's your excuse? So that was 10 things you didn't know were invented by Islam. Which one shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments down below. Give this video a like and subscribe to All Time 10s if you haven't done so already. In the meantime though, check out this great All Time 10s video which is on screen right now.